So welcome everyone. My name is Steve Beekler, and I'm very heartened by the turnout. I figure either there's a lot of interest in this, or there's a lot of cabin fever, or maybe a little bit of both. But what else are you going to do on a Tuesday morning at 11 o'clock? At least here in the Midwest. I'm not sure where everyone is from, but wherever you're from, welcome. I'm glad to have you here. I want to start out, obviously, with some introductions, tell you just a little bit about my background and whatever my qualifications here might be. I spent about, depending on when you start the clock, either a 30 or a 40-year academic career as a sociologist. Most recently, for the last 30 years, I taught at Minnesota State University, Mankato. And so in that time, I probably taught hundreds of classes, thousands of students, did a fair amount of scholarly writing, actually published 7 different books on topics like the women's suffrage movement, social movements, social movement theory, critical sociology, did a lot of writing in book chapters and articles as well. The ironic thing is, for all that writing, I don't think any of that really helps me very much in terms of what we're going to talk about today, because academic writing is supposed to be very objective and neutral, and the person doing the writing is not supposed to be part of the story. You never use the word I in academic writing. So it's a very different kind of writing that I have a lot of experience in, but as I said, I'm not sure it helps a whole lot in terms of what we're going to do today. What helps more so, I think, is my personal experience of surviving cancer. I'll say more about this later, but about 4.5 years ago, I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. And it's a long story, but the most important part to mention up here is I really feel I survived my cancer largely through the writing that I did from the very beginning, really to this day. I'm still writing about my story, and I'm still using that writing to understand it more fully and comprehend it and process it and come to terms with it. So eventually, although I didn't know it at the beginning, that writing led to a memoir. I'm still writing multiple blog posts. I'm recording webcasts with an organization called Patient Power, telling my story. I feel like I've been both living and telling my story with cancer for the last 4.5 to 5 years. Later on, if you want to track any of this stuff down, I have a website there. It's based loosely on my name, stevebeeklerauthor.com. You're welcome to explore that at your leisure. But I've also heard the stories of many, many other cancer survivors. I've been a continuous member of a support group for transplant patients for the last 4 years. I've also been a peer patient volunteer for now, I think, 4 or 5 different organizations, including Be the Match and the Leukemia Lymphoma Society. And when they have requests from patients who want to talk with a survivor, often with their same diagnosis, they'll contact these volunteers. So I've probably spoken in person or on the phone with up to 200 people in that role as a peer patient volunteer. So I've heard lots and lots of other stories as well. And that has sort of rounded out my understanding of what it's like to survive cancer, and also what it's like to be able to tell your story, whether that's in writing or verbally or whatever form that might take. It's reinforced my notion that storytelling is really a crucial part of the survival, recovery, healing process. You can't have a 30 or 40-year academic teach a class like this without having slides like this. We're going to take an initial sort of brief academic detour. I'm by no means an expert in this particular topic. I've sort of learned what I know in the last 3 or 4 years through the various volunteer activities I'm doing. But I have a pretty good reliable source who pointed me to some of the theories that are out there that suggest how storytelling, whether written or even oral storytelling, can be a very powerful mechanism. And so I'll just very briefly touch on a couple of these different kinds of theories. They have some interesting names. One class of theories is known as transportation theories, because it gets at how stories literally transport us into a different kind of world than the one we might be living in. And if they're told well, they can be a very vivid, believable world. And so sometimes make-believe can seem pretty darn real, as we know from our dreams, and also from the most powerful moving stories, novels, even movies that you may have watched. They can sometimes just take you into a totally different place for however long the movie lasts, or the book chapter, or what have you. There's another angle on this that has to do with social cognitive theories, and they're mainly focused on how stories can provide behavioral models for how people might want to alter their behavior. There's a lot of this work done for people who want to stop smoking, lose weight, achieve certain kinds of goals. And the notion here is that we can give you dry academic advice about, or medical advice about how to achieve a certain goal. But reading a story of someone who managed to do this can often be a more powerful motivator and a more powerful way of modeling whatever kind of behavior change people might be interested in doing. A lot of insights come from a category known as narrative theories. Narrative theories stress the fact that, again, in contrast to other kinds of ways of conveying information, stories can help us process information more effectively, especially if we sort of identify with the character who's at the center of the story. They can often be more effective in getting us to accept and embrace change, especially if we're seeking to make some kind of change. Again, the sort of model provided by a particular character or an individual in a story can be very effective at doing that. Another aspect of these narrative theories is that they can provide what are known as sort of surrogate social connections. If you've ever read a story, or again, watched a movie, or any kind of story that's presented where you very closely identify with a particular character. We maybe did this as kids when we had imaginary friends, but I think most of us have had the experience of identifying so closely with a character in a story that they become pretty real to us, and they have all the impacts that real people in our lives can have for as long as we participate in that story. There's also reason to think that stories can help us address and get to the emotional issues and the more existential issues that we all confront, especially as we're recovering from a lethal cancer diagnosis, and that this can be done more effectively, again, than other ways of conveying information and data. There's another category called exemplification theories, just getting at the fact that stories can often provide straightforward, simple, concrete examples of some phenomenon, of some experience, of some storyline that makes it more vivid and makes it more real for us. So what all these theories are really suggesting is that narrative can be very, very powerful, and often much more powerful than abstract scientific data. We've all been exposed to the statistics on this and that and risk and reward calculations, but it's all kind of impersonal and detached until you follow a particular story. I mean, maybe a good recent example is we're inundated these days with information about COVID survival rates, where things are better, where things are worse, how they're going. But if you watch the particular story of a particular patient and their caregiver and their families and what they've gone through, I think we can agree that often is much, much more powerful than all the numbers in the world that they can throw at us. So lots of good reason to think that stories can be very powerful, and more powerful than, again, those dry abstract statistics and scientific data. But here's a really important caveat about all these theories, is that they're really about how various kinds of stories impact the reader or impact the listener, and perhaps change them or get them to see their lives or their experience in a new light. And what I'm really interested in here is a little bit different. I'm not so interested in how stories change other people or impact other people. I'm interested in what they do for us as the narrators. What does it do for the storytellers to tell their story, as opposed to what does it do for the hearers or the listeners? So we're going to depart from these theories a little bit because they don't directly address that issue of what are the consequences or the impacts or the effects of doing our own storytelling. And that's kind of going to be the terrain that I want to examine here with us today. And there's no better way to do that than to just kind of jump in with both feet. So I'm going to ask you to do a couple writing exercises in the next few minutes and give you some time to do that. And we'll just take a second to kind of read through this entire slide before we start the clock on the 10-minute limit. But whether you're a survivor or caregiver, I think this will probably work best if you select some aspect of the illness, the diagnosis, the treatment, the recovery that you want to do some writing about. And the goal here is to do what's called a free write. And the idea behind a free write is, as the slide says, you want to tap into a kind of spontaneous stream of consciousness experience in your mind about this and turn it into words. So the emphasis should be on emotions, if possible. It should be on what first thing that comes to your mind. It should be following that wherever it takes you, first impressions, and then second and third impressions. Don't worry about editing. Don't worry about revising. Don't worry about grammar. Don't worry about polishing. Just kind of open the floodgates and let it go for as much as you can. And maybe it would help to think of this as if it were a private journal entry. This is not intended for anyone else to read. So it's for your eyes only. You don't have to worry about someone looking over your shoulder and reacting to what you're writing in a way that you might not like. And when we're done, you'll always have the option, but absolutely no obligation to share your writing. We'll talk more about what the experience of writing it was like than the actual writing. But if part of that experience is something you want to share, we will certainly go ahead and do that. So with that, I'm just going to start the timer here. We'll give you about 10 minutes uninterrupted to do writing on a laptop, on a word processing document, longhand on a yellow pad, however you do your writing. Just go ahead and launch yourself into this expressive writing exercise, see where it takes you, take it as far as you can, and we'll check back in about 10 minutes and see where things stand at that point. Well, I hope you had a chance to shake out the writer's cramp if you write longhand or if you type furiously, because we're going to jump right back in and do one more writing exercise. But this is going to be a little bit different. This is going to be called a peer, if it fit on the slide, I would have written peer helping narrative. So the shift here is, again, I want you to think back over your experience and your journey as either a patient or a caregiver. But this time, reflect a bit on what you learned, what you know now that you wish you knew at the beginning, and more pointedly, what you would tell someone else who was about to go through something similar to your experience. Maybe they have the same diagnosis, maybe they're going to get the same treatment. You know, in my case, it was a stem cell transplant, and I've talked to a lot of people pre-transplant about what that might be like. So here you're positioning yourself as a little bit more of an expert, if you will. You know stuff because of what you went through. And you're now going to address people who are about to go through at least some version of what you went through. So again, we'll set aside about 10 minutes, but imagine that you're addressing newly diagnosed cancer patients. That's your audience. It will be read by them. And you want to be as helpful to them as you possibly can be, summarizing lessons, tips, advice. It doesn't have to be one big lesson. It could be lots of little pieces of advice. But if you had this opportunity to address someone, what would you say? I know when I was going through my early treatment, I desperately wished I could hear this from someone, and there really wasn't anyone who could do that for me. There's now much more concern in doing that through these peer helping programs. So, and again, if you have time to edit and polish it up, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is just get those lessons down. What did you learn? And what do you want to convey to other people to make their journey as good as it can be? And we'll go ahead and start the clock and check back in with you in about 10 minutes. Let me jump ahead here and just talk a little bit about, put what we've just done here in a little broader context. And again, that's going to involve a little bit of an academic detour here. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I'm going to try and highlight the main points here. You can simply read a lot of this, but interestingly enough to me, when people study the benefits of expressive writing in a more supposedly scientific way, the evidence is really kind of mixed. Some studies find that it helps with things like mental distress and anxiety, and other meta studies where they look at a whole bunch of studies together conclude that it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of evidence that it really does help. There's a caveat in there about when they looked at people who wrote about their own cancer specifically, as opposed to other topics, it was more evident that they had some benefits. And my own take on this is that I think there are often benefits that can't easily be measured by studies like this. And so I would never discourage someone from doing this kind of writing, even if the research suggests it's not necessarily going to be helpful. I think it can still be therapeutic for lots of survivors. One quick example from my own experience. I don't do a lot of journal writing, but I recently reread something I wrote in a private journal from a year ago, and then something I wrote 5 years ago. And I realized, wow, I'm still wrestling with exactly the same issue I was 5 years ago. And I'd forgotten the fact that I had that history. So simply having a written record that you can read over again, I think that's a benefit that's not easily measured by an academic study, but it's a benefit nonetheless. I was also in a support group at one point where I heard someone make this point. I can't give you all the technical language of the different parts of the brain, but in essence, they said that our emotions tend to be stored in parts of our brain that are a little less accessible. We still experience the emotions very powerfully, but it's a little harder to kind of bring them to the forefront and process them. When we write about them, it sort of moves them to a different part of our brain that deals with language, and that's more accessible. And so that may be part of why writing can help with emotions and processing emotions. They become easier to access and to process once they're written. And the same thing may be true once they're spoken, which is maybe why talk therapy can sometimes be effective. Telling your story allows you to access and process things that you can't necessarily get to if you're simply spinning your wheels and thinking in your head. Now, what we did with these writing exercises, as you know, is we sort of did a tandem. We started with the expressive writing, talked about that for a bit, then went on to the peer writing. And that sequence of two different kinds of writing is sort of a mini replication of a larger academic study that was done on transplant survivors, cancer transplant survivors, that really shed some interesting light on how and maybe why certain types of writing help or don't help, or help more or help less. Briefly, in this study, they divided people into 4 different groups. They had people who did expressive writing only, like our first exercise. People who did peer writing only, like our second exercise. People who did neutral writing, just the facts, no emotions, no lessons, just the facts. In those 3 groups, there were no measurable benefits, at least as they were measuring benefits. But when they had people do the expressive writing first, and then the peer writing, the same sequence we just did, they found measurable benefits. And they actually saw improvement in some physical symptoms from people who were having trouble in recovery, general distress and mood, and they have measures of what's called health-related quality of life measures. So it was the combination of doing expressive writing first and then peer writing that was more effective than any of the other groups. And the interpretation that they have is that, well, the expressive writing that people did first brought some clarity to their emotions and to their thoughts and their cognitions because they put them into words. And that then made their peer writing for others more informative and more insightful. So it seemed to be that tandem of the 2 kinds of writing back to back that helped at least the transplant patients in this study both heal better and feel better and have better moods. And my own little take on that is, I think that peer writing exercise we did most recently, it puts the writer, it puts you in a position of some kind of control and agency, right? You know something, you have something to tell other people. It's not like you're the world's greatest expert, but at least you have lessons to share. And that seems to me to be almost an intuitively empowering position to be in. Expressive writing, not so much because you're so vulnerable with the emotions that you might be trying to access, but when you're writing for others and transmitting lessons, that's a different kind of stance, and I think it's a healthy one, again, by putting people in this sense of control and agency over what they're doing. So needless to say, if anyone wants references on all that stuff, I'm happy to provide it, but that's kind of the tip of the iceberg overview of what's going on with the research on this writing. And again, I would never discourage people from doing the expressive writing, even though some of the research is a little bit equivocal on how that works out. I'd like to briefly give you a little bit of a sense of how what path I traveled that led me to be such a big advocate of the value of writing. I'll do this briefly, and again, I'll rely partly on just people reading the slides quickly. But in June of 2016, I was in what I thought was perfectly good health. I've been in good health my entire life. I had no idea that cancer was about to take over my life. I just went in for a routine physical, as I do once a year. And my doctor found some very low white blood cell counts. So he said, well, you better see a hematologist, sent me to an oncologist, did a bone marrow biopsy, diagnosed acute myeloid leukemia, which is a very aggressive, fast-moving blood cancer. So within less than 24 hours of receiving the diagnosis, I was hospitalized, and 24 hours later, I started chemotherapy. week-long 24/7 chemotherapy treatment, 5 weeks in the hospital to treat the infections that follow with immunosuppression. But it worked, got me into temporary remission, got the data back on my cancer, and it said, well, you're in kind of an intermediate risk category, so it's not clear what your further treatment should be. They knew I needed something. If I was in a low risk category, probably more chemo, high risk category, stem cell transplant. I was in the middle, so I had to make a decision. I eventually opted for transplant. They had to find a donor, which they did. To keep me in remission till I could get to transplant, I had a round of what's called consolidation chemotherapy, a few complications there, back in the hospital, back out. But eventually in October, about 4 months after my diagnosis, I had a double umbilical cord blood stem cell transplant. The only thing I knew about my donors is they were a baby boy and a baby girl. So I named them Ralph and Gwen. And it turned out that Ralph was the donor that engrafted. I had evidence of that just 3 weeks after transplant. And there followed a long but gradual and eventually full recovery due to this stem cell transplant. So some little baby boy, and maybe more relevantly, his mother, somewhere in the world decided to donate that umbilical cord, and it was genetically typed and eventually matched to my body, and they saved my life. And I'll never get to know who it was because my donor technically will be a minor for the next, I don't know, 15 or 16 years, and there's no way I can track him down and thank him. But I thank everyone I know who's doing cord blood donations. So what got me through it, and eventually what got me through it was the writing, but I'll just briefly mention in passing some of the coping strategies that worked for me. Ironically enough, a couple months before my diagnosis, I took a community education class on mindfulness, meditation, and yoga. And for the first time, I took that stuff seriously. And so I had about 8 weeks of practice under my belt when my diagnosis came along. And I took all those skills to the hospital with me and did yoga and meditation and practiced mindfulness continuously. And it was an enormous help. I did as much physical activity as I could. At one point, the nurses told me about 2 weeks into my visit, they said, we think you're walking 5 miles a day because you're out of your room in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, and you're going all over the hospital. And I said, well, I never bothered to measure it, but I just know it feels good to be up and moving. And encountering other nurses and staff all throughout the hospital who got to know me as that guy who always walks through here and we talk and we chat. And I was recognized as a vertical, upright, relatively healthy looking person, even though I was trailing my IV pole alongside me. But I got that social reinforcement from seeing those people. I was proactive about my treatment. I organized my room the way I wanted it. I interacted as much as possible with nurses and doctors. I always had lots of questions. I wanted to know what was going on as best I could. And that just felt like, how else would you do it? Why would you want to be a passive patient just lying in a bed waiting for someone else to save you? I've always had a pretty weird sense of humor, and I never gave that up. I think that helped sustain me a lot, and occasionally entertained the people I was interacting with. I think you need some kind of worldview or mindset to get through this kind of thing, and for many people, that's religion. For me, it was more rooted in my social science background. So maybe like the engineers in this group, I wanted to understand how things work, and how can we make them work better, and what can we do to fix it? What can I do to help it? So I had a kind of practical problem-solving approach to what I was going through. There's background factors beyond my control that obviously helped because of my long-term professorship. I had a full year of paid sick leave at full salary, retired into a nice pension after that. Also had the privilege of being a relatively well-educated white male. So everybody I encountered in the medical establishment treated me with respect and dignity, and I never had to resolve those issues that sometimes confront other folks. I had great medical care, I had good social support, and this whole matter of stem cell transplant seems like a bit of a medical miracle. I now have my donor's DNA, I have his blood type, I have what's called a chimeric identity because I'm half him and half me. And in the last analysis, frankly, when I look at why some people make it and some people don't, I think there's just a lot of luck involved as well. But I had a lot of things going for me, some of which I could control, some of which just fell in my lap. So I can say 4.5 years out, I'm fully recovered. I'm as healthy as I feel as healthy as I ever did. And I'm going on with my life as best I can. The biggest thing that helped me though, and the reason I'm here today, and hopefully we're all here, is the role that writing played. And ironically enough, as some people here said, I started writing within a week of my hospitalization for the purely practical reason that I needed to inform my neighbors about what was going on. Because the day after I was hospitalized, my wife arrived at the emergency room of my hospital with unbearable leg pain. So they put her in my hospital. I was on the 4th floor. She was on the 6th floor. They figured out she had a hairline fracture in her femur. She stayed in the hospital for a week to have surgery and begin recovery. And then she went to a transitional care unit for a month of rehab. So on very short notice, our house was left completely abandoned for 5 weeks. And so I first said, I gotta let my neighbors know what's going on. You probably noticed we're not around. Here's the deal. I'm in the hospital with acute myeloid leukemia. She's in the hospital with a fractured femur. We won't be home for over a month. Can you pick up the mail and the papers? And almost immediately I realized this is a really slick way to keep in touch with people. So in the next few weeks, I went from emailing 7 neighbors to a couple dozen family members to 30 or 40 friends to another couple dozen colleagues. Eventually, I was writing to probably 80 or 90 people in this email group. And I wrote these long sort of reports, sometimes twice a week, sometimes once a week. I did this over 18 months of my full diagnosis, treatment, and recovery. And what I realized very early on is I thought I was writing for other people to keep them informed and keep them up to speed on my status. But that writing really became therapy for me, because in order to convey to them what was going on with me, I had to understand it. I had to understand it more clearly than I otherwise would have. And so I worked really hard to understand the facts of my diagnosis, but also to process my emotions, my reactions, what I was learning. I just worked really, really hard to tell the best story I could for them. And it ended up making much more sense out of what I was going through. And that was the benefit for me. Another big benefit was it got a lot of supportive feedback from people. People wrote back all the time. So in addition to the phone calls and the gifts and the visits in the hospital back in the day when you could have visits in the hospital, they would write me back in emails, and I got all kinds of support that was very nice. There was a lot of humor in these emails, and that was a way of telling people who don't know how to treat me, who don't know how to deal with me as a cancer patient. The humor was a way of saying, hey, I'm the person I've always been. And if you got a good joke, you better pass it along, because that's always been a part of who I am. So don't let the cancer thing overwhelm the other basis of our relationship, and let's keep in touch. So that writing really gave me a sense of control, a sense of agency. It held me together. It kept me whole. I make a distinction between medically surviving the cancer, but socially sustaining my identity. And along with all the other coping strategies, the writing really did that for me. So imagine my surprise about 18 months after this all started. Someone said, this stuff you've been writing is pretty interesting. You should turn it into a book. And I thought that was a crazy idea, but one thing led to another, and I published a book about it. In the midst of that, I came across someone else's book, just happens to be a sociologist named Arthur Frank. He's a Canadian sociologist. And he wrote a book called The Wounded Storyteller. And the thesis of his book is that doctors in the best case scenario can cure our bodies, or at least manage and treat our illnesses. But it's the storytelling that we do that really sustains our identity in exactly the way it had done for me. His view on modern medicine is kind of a good news, bad news story. It's very powerful, it's very effective, it's very high tech. But modern medicine has a tendency to kind of reduce patients to a pretty passive role. It's the doctors who are kind of the heroes of modern medicine. They cure us, they save us, hopefully, they do all that. And from the perspective of modern medicine, there's not a whole lot for patients to do except be good patients and be compliant and do what they say. So I liken it to, if your car breaks down and you take it into the shop to get it repaired, and the mechanics fix your car, and you're in the waiting room drinking bad coffee, just waiting for them to fix things. It's a pretty passive role to be in. And what I learned through my experience, and what Arthur Frank talks about, is when we have the opportunity to tell our stories, it puts us a bit more in a kind of driver's seat. It gives us an active role. We become, the phrase I like to use is, we become the author of our own lives if we can tell our story. and edit it and revise it and package it and convey it to people. That's a very active process, and I think it's healthy mentally. I think it's beneficial emotionally. Obviously, I'm a big advocate of that. Arthur Frank talks about there how there are three kinds of stories that ill persons can come up with and can try and convey. There are what he calls chaos stories. And chaos stories are probably common to almost everyone who gets a surprise diagnosis and your whole world just kind of blows up in your face. He says chaos stories are often, they're sort of more just experienced than something you can coherently tell. In my case, I mentioned I had a surprise diagnosis. My wife had a surprise diagnosis within 24 hours of mine, and we ended up in the same hospital. And 3 weeks into this experience, I'm in the hospital with 2 more weeks to go. She's in a TCU with 2 more weeks to go. And there's a thunderstorm in the West Metro. And I knew it was raining because I had a little window, but mostly I just saw another part of the hospital. I had no idea how vicious it was. So at 7 o'clock that night, my neighbors emailed me a picture. It's a picture of the 65-foot locust tree in our front yard that was no longer upright. In fact, most of it fell on the garage roof and bounced into the driveway and filled the entire driveway and went out into the street. And then they sent a second picture, and I thought this must be the same tree from a different angle. But this was the silver maple tree in the backyard, also 60 feet tall, came down on the deck and the garage and the family room roof and punched a hole in the roof so water could get in. So I'm stuck in the hospital for 2.5, 3 more weeks. Sue's stuck in the TCU for that time. And our house has just been partially demolished by this storm. That's a chaos story. And everybody has their own version of chaos stories, but things were just falling apart faster than I could comprehend them. Well, I eventually ended up dealing with insurance adjusters and roofers and contractors, and we got it all taken care of. But it was a good example of this notion of everything is just spinning out of control, and I can't even imagine how to hold it together. The second type of story, even more common, are what Frank calls restitution stories. This is a kind of story that goes, initially I was healthy, then I became sick, then I got treatment, and now I'm hopefully getting better again. This is a story of how doctors kind of swoop in and they're the heroes and the patient is passive, but hopefully the doctors do their job and you get better. And you can tell a good restitution story about how you hit some bumps in the road, but in the end, the outcome is looking pretty positive. And those are important stories, but as Arthur Frank says, again, doctors are center stage in those stories and patients are kind of passive. So the third and most important story that Arthur Frank talks about is what he calls quest stories, when we really sort of take the reins of our own story and we find whatever meaning and whatever purpose and whatever lessons can be found through our particular journey through this illness and diagnosis and treatment and everything that follows. That may well be very different for different people, but that's the most important stage for Arthur Frank, and certainly for me, because again, you get to be the author of your own life in telling and composing that story. So much to my surprise, reading Arthur Frank just perfectly illuminated what I'd stumbled into with this process of writing that really goes on to this day. I'm still writing blog posts about recovering from a stem cell transplant, and every time I do something like that, I understand my own story a little bit better. So that's what's part of what has made me such a big advocate of the process of writing. We're getting very close to the end here. I want to leave time for some final comments, so I'll just let this slide sit up there for people to read. I will say a bit about the second to the last item, the WISE study that I'm in. It stands for Writing for Inspiration, Strength, and Ease. And this is an effort to solicit both expressive and peer writing, like we did, those two-stage writing, from transplant survivors, which will obviously benefit them in all the ways we've talked about. But the ultimate goal is to get all this information up on a website, categorized, classified, indexed, and tagged in certain ways. So current patients can go to the website and basically dial up a story about someone with their diagnosis, their treatment plan, their age, whatever they want, and go and read the stories of other people. So it kind of completes the loop of what we were talking about just a minute before. It could provide a bit of a model if Gilda's Club wants to seriously pursue this notion of building up an archive of lessons from survivors to go on to current patients that they can access. I'll be happy to talk more with folks there if they want to do that. But it's a very promising way to close the circle between those who've been through an experience, learned a lot from it, and those who are starting in on that experience. And so with that, with apologies for rushing through because I messed up my timetable,